by many stories, one of which was the bipartisan budget bill for border security. And the big number is that the president was not happy with was $1.375 billion to build a border barrier. He could do whatever he wanted with it, which shows an advantage. But the question was, would the president add something with that? Would he declare a national emergency? I just got off the phone with Mick Mulvaney, Chief of Staff, and the answer is a resounding yes. And for the first time, you're going to hear exactly how much it is and where the money's coming from. It's going to be about $8 billion. He had the 1.3, then $600 million will come from the Treasury Forfeiture Fund. $2.5 billion out of DOD. They consulted with Mick Mulvaney and the White House over the last few months on what they could actually do, and they're going to use some money they feel they can spare on the drug interdiction account. Then they came across with $3.5 billion for the military construction budget. They feel they can help in that respect. And then, of course, they have additional money. It all adds up to $8 billion. So the 1.375, not enough for the president. He wanted 5.7. He walks away at the end of the day with $8 billion. And, of course, the Democrats and some Republicans are upset about that. Now, let's go to Capitol Hill. Now, earlier today, we understand David spun that the Senate voted with 83 yeses to pass this bipartisan bill. What could you tell us about the House tonight?
Yeah, Brian, 83-16. It has been a very busy day here on Capitol Hill. The House is getting ready to vote on this final passage here sometime in the next hour and a half, 2 hours. We are expecting this to be a resounding yes if you talk to Democrats. That's what House Speaker Nancy Pelosi says. Now, after the House votes on this, it's going to go over to the White House. You mentioned you spoke to Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney, President Trump, the rest of his team ready, anxiously awaiting to see the final tally, see this final legislation. Now, Senator Mitch McConnell, he's the majority leader. He made sure that he had assurances from the White House today that President Trump would indeed declare a national emergency for that $1.37 billion border barrier, enough for 55 miles of fencing along the Texas-Mexico border. Now, there are several provisions. Now, one of them, Brian, out of the many provisions, is that the Department of Homeland Security, they'll have to discuss any construction with local leaders before that construction takes place. But the big news here right now is the House. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said today she is confident this will pass in the House. We're going to stand by, bring you any other updates. Brian.
And David, we'll go back to you, especially if that vote actually takes place, and maybe some people change their vote when they hear about the president's declaration of a national emergency, which is official, will be signed tomorrow. I'd like to now go out to Congressman Chip Roy. The Republican is on the floor getting some of this news. Now, Congressman, I understand you are not thrilled with the additional funds that the president is going to be declaring tomorrow. Why?
Well, hi, Brian. Thanks for having me on. You know, look, my primary concern here is that the Congress hasn't done its job. They've left the president having to figure out how to handle this and how to secure the border of the United States, which is fundamentally our duty as a sovereign nation. He shouldn't be in that position. But if the president signs this bill, this very bad bill, then I believe he might actually undermine the very emergency that he's trying to declare. Congress has not done its duty. We've now sent him up a bill.
Individuals who've been let into this country, a potential sponsor can be a distant relative. You know, so you played out the numbers. It's probably going to be upwards of 1 million people who are going to claim this protection from removal. They can't be deported according to this bill if they're even in the household of a potential sponsor of an unaccompanied alien child. It's a disastrous provision. There's also a provision that says the president can't impose any border fees on crossings. That's one way he was going to make Mexico pay for the wall, is impose a fee on people coming in from Mexico. Well, the bill doesn't allow him to do that. So I blame the House, or rather the Republican negotiators, for putting him in this really bad position. He needs the $1.3 million to build the wall, but he's got these poison pills attached to it, and they really shouldn't have put the president in this position.
Well, it's true. So you got the bill, and then you have tomorrow the president's going to be signing he's going to actually declare a national emergency. It's been done 58 times since the law went into effect and giving the president his power since 1976. So will that solve a lot of these problems?
Well, yes and no. The national emergency will empower the president to free up additional funds to spend on building the badly needed border wall. And I just came last week from the Arizona border where it's wide open in many places. We absolutely need it. We need to be building immediately. But what happens with the bill is that those funds become available immediately. There is a chance when the Democrats and their allies take this to court, the national emergency, that if they draw lucky and get a judge who is an activist and wants to see the president's wall project stopped, that judge might enjoin the use of these additional funds that come from the national emergency. So he needs that $1.3 billion to get started immediately. We'll see, but obviously the president is looking for money everywhere to make good on his #1 promise that he made to the American people to build that wall. So, I know where he's coming from here. He wants to stay faithful to that promise, and he sees the incredible emergency we have on our southern border. And like I say, just coming from the border recently, it's happening every day, and it is a big problem.
And keep in mind, President Obama did 12 of these national state emergencies. He did the same thing with DACA, and so far the Supreme Court has not even taken that up yet. Maybe this will be on a fast track. In the meantime, the president could possibly spend the money. Chris Kobach, you're all over this. Thanks so much for reading the 1,000 pages. We'll see if it passes the House today.
Almost my pleasure.
Almost your pleasure, right? Let's go out to Mark Stein for some deep thoughts. Mark, after the president made it clear today that he's going to be declaring using emergency funds, immediately Nancy Pelosi came out and said, well, okay, maybe a Democratic president will decide guns. There's too many guns in this country. Will declare a state of emergency. That would not apply to this provision. But what do you think the ramifications are of the president doing this?
Well, I think it's difficult with guns because guns are in the Constitution. I'm not sure it would be so much more difficult if she wanted to do something on, say, climate change and the Green New Deal and that kind of thing. So I do share the concerns of people about having to actually police one's national frontier through an emergency measure. And I think actually, just to go back to what Chris Kobach was saying, Brian, I think we all know the first judge the Democrats lay this in front of, whichever rinky-dink district court judge in the Ninth Circuit they decide to give the gift of this emergency, national emergency to, he is going to order a stay on it. And then we get to the stuff that's in the bill, this hideous bill, where it actually gives a veto to municipalities as to whether any border wall can be constructed. There are a lot of huge problems here, and most of them arise because the Republicans, when they control Congress, didn't get this done in the first 2 years.
Right. It is strange. They only gave him 1.6, and they only offered him that even in the second year when Paul Ryan was in charge. And we're splitting the screen, Mark, for a very good reason. I know you like usually your face on the whole screen, but we're doing it for a very good reason. We're watching the vote and the speeches come out of the House. Normally the House would vote first, but because of the funeral today, they asked for the Senate to go first. In the big picture, the president sits there and negotiates in a bipartisan way. Many people feel as though the Democrats got more than the Republicans. Fine. But this $8 billion should keep many conservatives happy, knowing that the president continues to fight and trying to fulfill a promise. Would you buy that?
Well, I think we need some clarity on what the bill actually says, because some of this stuff about, again, the language that Chip Roy was talking about, potential sponsors, that appears to incentivize human trafficking. I don't know why the Democrats are in favor of that, but the Republicans certainly shouldn't be.
All right, Mark, thanks so much. Again,
thanks a lot, Brian.
Just called us. You got it. $600 million will come from Treasury, $2.5 billion from DOD drug interdiction, $3.5 for military construction budget, and that'll get you at about $8 billion. That'll build a lot of wall and bring a lot of security. Let's see what happens over the next 24 to 48 hours as we continue to watch that vote in the House. In the meantime, while we watch that, coming up next in a couple of minutes, Tucker Carlson takes on the issues like Andy McCabe and his new book and accusations. Later on, China, Marco Rubio, his greatest concerns as we try to reconfigure our trade relationship. Don't miss a minute.
one individual in this situation, because these are very serious conversations that they were having. But it does appear that those are conversations they were having.
Yes.
And those are based off of the Constitution, right? It's the 25th Amendment of the Constitution, which does act as a safeguard should we ever run into that situation. So for me,
run into what situation?
Run into a situation
where you
where
don't like the president or disagree with his Russian
or where
policy?
you feel like the president is incapable of doing the job. And so I think I don't have a problem that they had these discussions. At the end of the day, they landed at no. And I think that's the important thing to remember. So the system worked the way it was supposed to as it relates to whether or not to remove the president.
No, because if you find yourself as an executive branch employee disagreeing with the policies of the person for whom you work, you leave, you quit. And you can state so publicly if you want. You have the right to do that. What you're not allowed to do is try to take power from the one elected guy in the entire branch of government, because that's not democratic. It's the opposite of democratic. But that's what they tried to do.
Agreed. But what you're saying is that they were considering it because they didn't like the policies. And I don't think that's the case at all.
Why were they considering
There's a genuine concern about how Russia was involved in the 2016 election.
Okay, but so the amendment was written after Woodrow Wilson suffered a stroke in office and his wife wound up running the country. I guess she was a fine president, but we didn't want to repeat that. So this was specifically written, and every lawyer knows this, including the ones at the FBI, for a president who's incapacitated, not for a president whose policies you find repugnant or disagree with or don't. You know what I mean? Just because he's not a neocon doesn't mean that you can remove him from power.
I agree. And again, I don't think that's what they were thinking about. There was big concern, again, when you look at the timing of McCabe going into office, and again, he's obviously a flawed messenger in many ways, but when you look at the time that he was elevated to his position was right after James Comey was fired. And why was James Comey fired? As the president said himself, because he wanted the Russia investigation to end.
Okay, but
clearly there was a concern.
But the other way, well, there was a concern because a guy they liked who was their boss got fired, which is absolutely the prerogative of this or any president to fire his own employees if he wants, for whatever reason he wants. And if you don't like it, impeach him or vote against him.
Unless it's viewed as obstruction of justice.
Okay, but but under no plausible scenario could it be. I mean, because of course the FBI director was free to say whatever he wanted to congressional committees or the Mueller investigation or write a book, which indeed he did. So it's not obstruction of justice. It's not going to prevent justice from working its way to its conclusion. I just wonder, why are liberals all of a sudden defending this radically empowered federal law enforcement agency? You don't see this as a threat to the Kamala Harris administration 2 years from now, for real?
Yeah, no, and I get the question. I don't see liberals defending this. I think what we're defending is protecting the investigation. So we have a good understanding of exactly what Russia was doing in the 2016 elections and whether they were aided by anyone here in the United States. And part of that question centers on the President of the United States and some of his closest associates.
But we've spent 2 years looking into that, and the conclusion of the Senate committee that's looked into it is there's no collusion.
That's not true. That's what the chair of that committee said. That wasn't a statement from the committee as a whole. Okay. That's what the chair said.
Is there a point at which
the ranking member, just to be fair, the ranking member said he disagreed. So
no, the ranking member did not say that.
And official court documents have come to the conclusion that there was some collusion. We saw that in Manafort documents. And we've also seen it in the Roger Stone documents. Whether that collusion rises to the president is the question.
Okay, just for the record, there's no, quote, collusion with Russia in the Roger Stone indictments. Okay, no one has been indicted for colluding with anybody so far.
Acting as a liaison between WikiLeaks on behalf of the Russians.
But that is not, look, it's not a crime and it's not collusion. But leaving that aside, I just want to end on this. Does it really honestly, as a citizen, not bother you that a federal law enforcement agency discussed removing the President of the United States by non-democratic means for basically disagreeing with them and firing their boss? That doesn't bother you at all?
The premise of your question, if that was the case, would bother me. That's not what that was about.
Let's leave the last part off. Whatever it was about.
I'm comforted by the fact that they had the discussion as provided by the 25th Amendment, and they landed on no. So again,
it's like saying, I talked about killing my wife. I didn't do it. You know what I mean? And there's a difference. Like, I'm not a murderer. It's like, oh, yeah, but you discussed it. What does that say about you? Something ominous, no?
What it says, it's less about the people and more about the concerns they have about the president, who's trying to stop an investigation into his campaign. If he's got nothing to hide, he should have nothing to fear.
Okay. Give me your email password if you've got nothing to. We'll talk about it off air. John, thank you very much.
Thank you.
In his 60 Minutes interview, McCabe admits that his attempt to undermine the president began almost immediately after his boss, Jim Comey, was fired. And it was, of course, due to Russia.
I was speaking to the man who had just run for the presidency and won the election for the presidency, and who might have done so with the aid of the government of Russia, our most formidable adversary on the world stage. And that was something that troubled me greatly.
How long was it after that you decided to start the obstruction of justice and counterintelligence investigations involving the president?
I think the next day, I met with the team investigating the Russia cases, and I asked the team to go back and conduct an assessment to determine where are we with these efforts and what steps do we need to take going forward.
Alan Dershowitz is a retired Harvard Law School professor. He's the author of the book, The Case Against the Democratic House Impeaching Trump, and he joins us tonight. Professor, thanks very much for coming on. So now the suspicions of many are confirmed by one of the players in it. The Department of Justice has discussed trying to remove the president using the 25th Amendment. What's your reaction to that?
Well, if that's true, it is clearly an attempted coup d'etat. Relating to what your former guest said, let's take the worst case scenario. Let's assume the President of the United States was in bed with the Russians, committed treason, committed obstruction of justice. The 25th Amendment simply is irrelevant to that.
Right.
That's why you have an impeachment provision.
Exactly.
The 25th Amendment is about Woodrow Wilson having a stroke. It's about a president being shot and not being able to perform his office. It's not about the most fundamental disagreements. It's not about impeachable offenses. And any Justice Department official who even mentioned the 25th Amendment in the context of President Trump has committed a grievous offense against the Constitution. The framers of the 25th Amendment had in mind something very specific,
right,
and trying to use the 25th Amendment to circumvent the impeachment provisions or to circumvent an election is a despicable act of unconstitutional power grabbing. And you were right when you said it reminds me of what happens in third world countries. Look, these people may have been well-intentioned. They may believe that they were serving the interests of the United States, but you have to obey the law, and the law is the Constitution. And the 25th Amendment is as clear as could be. Incapacity, unable to perform office. That's what you need. That's why you need 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate agreeing, and it has to be on the basis of a medical or psychological incapacity, not on the basis of even the most extreme crimes, which there's no evidence were committed. But even if they were, that would not be a basis for invoking the 25th Amendment.
So this is not simply right.
And I challenge any left-wing person to get on television and to defend the use of the 25th Amendment. I challenge any of my colleagues who are in the Get Trump at Any Cost camp to come on television and justify the use of the 25th Amendment other than for physical or psychiatric incapacity.
I bet they're doing that right now. But this is an attack on our system, I would say, not just on the president. Alan Dershowitz, thank you very much.
It's an attack on our system. It's an attack on the Constitution. Thank you.
Scary. We have an update for you tonight on language in the border security bill. One part of that bill says essentially that illegal immigrant families can pick up illegal immigrant children from federal custody, and that DHS will not be notified of that. Any language added to the bill is there for a reason, and the reason here is very clear. It will make it easier for children coming from Central America to be aided by illegal immigrants here in the United States. Now, this may be motivated by goodwill. We could debate it. But in effect, it creates a harmful incentive. It will encourage more children to make the long and dangerous trek up through Central America to the United States. We'll continue to stay on top of the details of this bill because they're worth paying attention to. Well, for generations, everybody in America knew what the stereotypes were for the two political parties. Democrats were the party of the working class, coal miners, factory workers, your local beat cop. Republicans were the party of lawyers and doctors. They spent a lot of time at country clubs, remember? Things have changed a lot. Now Democrats have become the party of the elite professional class. They're consultants, iBankers, socialites, eager to lecture you about open borders, global warming from their gated communities. Nobody knows that change better or has watched it more carefully than the author of Hillbilly Elegy, J.D. Vance. We spoke to him recently about it. J.D. Vance, thanks for joining us. Thank you. So, because you don't live in Washington and you think bigger thoughts than the rest of us who are completely consumed by this dumb news cycle, I want to ask you a broader question. The parties have realigned. They don't represent the same people they thought they represented or that they have represented for the last 70 years. I'm not sure their leaders understand this, but you do. Who do the parties represent as of right now?
Well, at a big level, the Democratic Party increasingly represents professional class elites.
Yes.
And Republicans represent middle and working class wage earners in the middle of the country. Now, I will say, I think Democratic leaders kind of get this. If you look at the big proposals from the 2020 Democratic presidential candidates, universal child care, debt-free college, even Medicare for all, which is framed as this lurch to the left, but is really just a big handout to doctors, physicians, pharmaceutical companies, and hospitals. They sort of get that they're the party of the professional class, and a lot of their policies are geared towards making life easier for professional class Americans. The problem I have is that my party, the Republican Party, hasn't quite figured out that we basically inherited a big chunk of the old FDR coalition. The middle of the country, working and middle class, blue collar folks, the sort of people who work, pay their taxes, send their kids to the military. That's increasingly the base of the Republican Party, but the Republican donor elites are actually not aligned with those folks in a lot of ways, and so there's this really big mismatch, big picture within the Republican Party.
So I'm completely fascinated by what you just said, something I've never thought of in my life, that Medicare for all is actually a sop to the professional class. That's a whole separate segment, and I hope you'll come back and, and unpack that all. But more broadly, what you're saying, I think, is that the Democratic Party understands what it is and who it represents and affirmatively represents them.
Yes.
They do things for their voters, but the Republican Party doesn't actually represent its own voters very well.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, look at who the Democratic Party is. And look, I don't like the Democratic Party's policies. Most of the times I disagree with them. But I at least admire that they recognize who their voters are, and they actually just as raw, cynical politics do a lot of things to serve those voters. Now look at who Republican voters increasingly are. They're people who disproportionately with the president in the campaign. But the Never Trump phenomenon, I think, is primarily not about the president. It's about the people who were most excited about somebody who was anti-elitist effectively taking over the Republican Party. They recognize that Trump was, whatever his faults, a person who instinctively understood who Republicans needed to be for. And at the end of the day, I think they don't necessarily want the Republican Party to be for those folks. They don't like the policies that will come from it. They don't like necessarily the country that will come from it. And so there's a lot of vitriol directed at people who voted for Donald Trump, whether excitedly or not.
If the Republican Party has a future, it'll be organized around the ideas you just laid out, maybe led by you or someone who thinks like you. I'm serious. That's what it needs, I think. J.D. Vance, thank you.
Thanks, Tucker.
It is time for Final Exam. The remarkable Lauren Blanchard going tonight for her 8th win in a row. The question is, have you paid closer attention than she has to this week's news? Find out after the break. All right, it's time right now to get your...
Shortly, but we do want to cover the breaking news as it develops, and what a night we've had already. We understand normally the procedure would be that the Senate would vote second when you have a bipartisan bill like this border budget bill to extend funding of the government until September 30th. But because of the funeral of Congressman Dingell, the House said, hey, can we vote late at night? So the Senate had their vote, and they had 83 votes for, so it passes. The House, at this very moment, as I split the screen with them, is beginning to vote. And they're going to vote for the next 15 minutes on the passage of the bill. Now, it's expected to pass as we bring in Mark Stein. Mark, the one thing I'm wondering is, being that it's become clear and we reported at the top of the hour that the president's going to take the $1.375 billion and all the provisions that are with it to build the barrier, and there's more money. There's $49 billion in here for other things, but he's going to take that. But the being that he's getting about $8 billion total in emergency funds, national emergency funds, which he can declare constitutionally, I'm wondering if some liberals are going to defect from that. What do you think?
So the theory would be that if they think he's serious about doing it, then they would object to this bill because he does need the starting money. He needs that additional, he needs that billion and change just so he can get going before, as we were talking about before, some district court judge in the Ninth Circuit somewhere decides to strike it down. I think what will be interesting about this is the dynamic between the Freedom Caucus, which in the House, which has felt it does not actually have any meaningful leverage on this, and the president's own inclinations. But the language of this bill, I mean, this is an appallingly written bill. As you say, it's very weird for it to be starting in the Senate because, you know, funding bills normally start in the House. There's a great sense that a lot of this is being kind of made up as it goes along. But there are things in that bill that are poorly drafted and that have huge implications. And legislators owe that to their constituents beyond anything else. All this wording that nothing in this bill or any other bills, for example. What does or any other bills mean in there? He can't ever build a wall in the Rio Grande Valley. No way, no how, not now, not never. I mean, this isn't the way republics of citizen representatives draft legislation.
Right, and we're watching this tally go right now. Nita Lowey, who is in charge of appropriations, she's chairperson, and she's the one who really was part of that led the 17-person bipartisan bicameral committee. She just spoke 5 minutes before we hopped on, just while we're in the break, Mark, and she was saying, okay, let's the voting start. It's going to be electronic, and we have right now, it looks 122 to 22, so it looks pretty overwhelming. If you missed at the top of the hour, we did speak to Mick Mulvaney, and Mick Mulvaney broke down where he's getting the additional money that the president will officially sign in an executive order in national emergency. He's getting $600 million for the Treasury Forfeiture Fund. He's getting $2.5 billion from the DoD Drug Interdiction Account, $3.5 billion from the military construction budget. Now, over the last 3 months, he's been asking people, come up with some money you think that will help, because it's all in the name of national security. But I want to go now, and this is the money, how it breaks down. Obviously, Nancy Pelosi is going to, well, it's just a matter of time before she challenges this or somebody challenges this in court. David Spun is actually on the House floor covering all this as the vote develops. It's round now 129 to 28. David, any surprises so far?
Well, hey, Brian, that's the vote total right now. The actual final number is 217. That would be the magic number, I should say. We're waiting. Once it gets to 217, then you can officially say that they have the votes needed to actually pass that bill, combine that with the Senate version, then go ahead and send it over to the White House. Nancy Pelosi, the House Speaker, said today she has been confident from the beginning that this was not going to be a problem. She said this was going to pass. Also, Brian, she mentioned that there may be some legal challenges if the president declares declares a national emergency, she said that it could cause some type of precedent issues, meaning that if a Democrat gets elected next time, they could declare a national emergency for what they feel would constitute a national emergency. So right now it's a 15-minute vote. We should know, according, I'm looking right now from some emails from our House producer Chad Pergram, the final tally should come somewhere around the top of the hour in about 15 minutes. And the magic number in the House is 217 as we watch those votes tally now. And then at that point, there will be a ceremony. Nancy Pelosi, the House Speaker, will sign it and then send it over to the White House, where you've been speaking to the Chief of Staff, and the President's team will review it before he signs it. Brian?
David, real quick, 10 seconds. Anybody say something of note in their remarks before the vote took place that our viewers should know about?
Well, we do know that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she is a liberal Democrat from New York. As she was walking in, somebody spoke to her off camera, and she said that she would be voting no because the actual bill gives money to Homeland Security. She said that she wants to defund ICE and parts of Homeland Security. Brian?
Right. She's definitely different. Always trying to stand out on every vote at every moment. David Spun, thanks so much. Mark Stein, thank you very much. Back in a moment, we're covering Tucker Carlson Live is covering all the breaking events in Washington. Don't move.
In American life. A few months ago, Amazon announced plans to open 2 new headquarters, one in Northern Virginia, the other in New York City. Those cities both won the sweepstakes to provide the biggest corporate giveaways to Amazon. But in New York, that plan met resistance from some locals who said the city ought to focus on helping its own residents, improving its own infrastructure rather than giving billions to the world's richest man. Apparently, those protests succeeded. Today, Amazon announced it will be canceling its planned headquarters in New York. Virginia, no such luck. They're still coming. China has risen rapidly to become the chief economic and political rival of the United States. No one in Washington recognizes that, but it's clearly true. But China is not content to be the equal of this country. China wants to be our superior. Its communist government is pursuing an initiative called Made in China 2025. It seeks to make China the dominant player in 10 advanced industries, including robotics, artificial intelligence, and aerospace. And they're getting a major assist from the United States, where many in our ruling class view outsourcing as a boon to corporate profits. What can be done to stop this? We spoke recently to Marco Rubio, senator from Florida, about it, and here's what he said. Senator Rubio, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you.
So you have said, crystally, in very clear language, China is growing at the expense of America. What does that mean?
It means they're trying to take over all the industries that are going to dominate the 21st century, and they're not out innovating us to do it. They're cheating. I mean, they're stealing our secrets. They're forcing our companies to transfer technology. They're funding their companies so their companies can go out and bid against ours, undercut us because they don't have to make a profit. The Chinese government is backing them. And then when they do it in enough places, they put us out of business, and then they control that industry. You know, for years we were told, don't worry, the Chinese are doing the lower-end manufacturing stuff, but the big stuff is still being made in America. Well, now they're going for the big. They're coming for the big stuff. We're going to have nothing left.
So if you sought an advantage in trade against another country and you were able to raise their energy prices far above current market, that would give you a huge advantage, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. And if you did it to yourself, as someone's suggesting, that it's a self-inflicted damage. There is going to be no new Green Deal in China. They do all the stuff where they go around the world and talk about how they're going to get carbon emissions, but they say that'll be later, by the way, once we become a rich and prosperous country. They already are. And bottom line is that it's one of the areas where the United States has been blessed with the resources to be globally competitive, and we shouldn't be surrendering that.
So why would we ever sign up for a program that in effect is unilateral disarmament against China? So we're not going to use any fossil fuels. We're going to shut down our energy sector and our nuclear sector, but China doesn't have to. Why would we ever do something like that?
Because I think there are people that think America's a planet. America's a country. the rest of these countries are going to do what they're going to do. Look, that's fine. I want the air to be cleaner. I want us to be more energy efficient. I think that you get there by allowing the innovations to get you there and other practices, which you don't get there by destroying and gutting your economy. And so ultimately, the people who are proposing that will have to defend it and why they're offering it. It's a ridiculous idea. You can see that a lot of Democrats are hiding from it, and some are just flat out saying it's crazy. Others are very proud of what they're putting out there. But bottom line is this: it is unilateral disarmament economically. It's worse than that. It's actually self-inflicted damage that we would do to ourselves if even pieces of that were implemented.
But if you really believe that carbon dioxide was a deadly pollutant destroying the Earth, and you look at the numbers, and China emits more than twice what the United States does,
right?
Why wouldn't you be protesting outside the Chinese embassy?
Well, again, I think these are people that think America's a planet. They think that somehow if we do it, it'll matter, that the rest of the world isn't going to sort of eat up the difference because of their rate of growth. And it's not just China, it's India and a bunch of other places. But the second thing I ask is, fine, then let's do more nuclear energy and let's shift more to natural, make it easier to access natural gas. That's much cleaner than some of the other fuels, but they're against those too. If the idea is that we're going to power this country into the 21st century with solar panels and windmills, that's not going to work. I mean, it doesn't work anywhere. So you've got to have some consistent source of revenue, and you've got to do it in a way that that doesn't destroy or gut your economy. But they're against those things as well. Nuclear energy is nearly impossible now to